Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to today's workshop. I'm going to be talking to you about international law, which I've been asked to do. I myself am a graduated Master of Laws, which means that I technically should know all these things. I do-ish. And I'm currently just working and living that kind of life. Also in terms of debating, I've also been debating since 2014-ish. So I've been debating for a long while as well, and I've seen a lot of debating and have quite some experience with that. And so what is going to be the plan for today? As I also wrote on the event page itself, the plan for today is not to teach you all to understand international law and to be a class in that as such. That would take more than 30 minutes. It is instead a class in understanding some basic mechanisms in it so that it is possible for you to debate it. So after this, the ideal is that you are able to understand why things move in the way that they do without understanding sort of like all of the underlying theory. That is to say, I will teach you how to, similar to mathematics, I'll teach you how to use an algorithm rather than teaching you how to understand it. Cool. So I had an idea I was told to be very innovative with my class and use some sort of tech implementation. And I was going to do a word cloud. Instead, I'm just going to do it manually. So we're going to be very analog, but still extremely innovative because you don't have to use tech in order to be innovative. But we'll do that at the end. And what I'm going to do is going to ask you all to think about one or two concepts about international law that you have learned or just been reminded of throughout this workshop that you think that you'd want to use in the debate that we're going to have afterwards, for everyone online, for the next debate that you'll have in terms of on international law or international relationships. Just one or two concepts that you're going to want to use and try and develop an argument around. So try and keep that sort of in the back of your mind. But of course, priority is to be attentive towards what I'm saying, of course. Cool. Two things I'm going to be talking about. Number one, sort of the most basic notion of international law, which is bindingness. How is it binding? How does that work? And is it even law? And then secondly, I'm going to talk about sort of that's sort of like trying to understand some basic mechanisms. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about some debating tips. I'm just basically going to talk about how do you debate international law. So let's talk about bindingness.
End your suffering.
Thank you. Much appreciated. So bindingness. So does anyone, and I'll take PYs audibly if there's anything from anyone online, but is there anyone here or online who has any comments or thoughts, or like how do you think that international law is binding? What are your thoughts on it? Any words that you've heard about how it works, or how does it work?
It works inside some kind of organization that has a treaty and needs to enforce any given contract.
Okay, so what was said from the room was that it works in some kind of organization that has a treaty that it seeks to enforce. Very good. Definitely some points. We'll also say organization.
That can enforce.
That can enforce, yes, yeah. But that's in the note for it, yeah. Any other things regarding international law? Things you've heard about it, things you think, yeah?
Say there's a lack of enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Also correct. Good. Could you elaborate a little bit? How do you think that there's a lack of enforcement?
We have all these treaties and some international organizations,
Mhm.
but you don't have a world police. So if a state decides not to follow what they've signed,
Mhm.
then it depends highly on that state's position. So if they are a powerful, wealthy country, then they might very well get away with it. If they are less powerful and less wealthy, then the other states might bully them into it, but only if these other wealthy, powerful states have an incentive to do so.
Mhm. So the answer to the question, is it binding, is it depends.
As always.
As always,
On paper it is.
on paper, it is. All right, very good. Yeah,
I mean, some of it also sounds quite symbolic. Like if the ICJ or whatever declares you an international war criminal, not a lot happens except you might become the next president of Libya. Recently have been.
true, true. So what was said was that also, for example, if you get convicted by the ICJ, not a lot necessarily happens. So generally, the consensus around this metaphorical table that we are sitting around is that it's flimsy, right? That there's no clear idea of how binding it is. Good. Now that leads us to talk about some actual legal theory. So, is it binding? It depends. And what does it depend on? Consent. This is one of the founding principles of public international law. That is to say, the international law that governs relationships between states. What I'll also be clear here. We're not going to be talking about private international law, which is the governing of agreements and contracts between companies that cross international borders. We're going to be talking about the law that governs between states. So the foundational principle of international law is consent. If a country does not want to be bound by something, it is not bound. That is what separates it as well from national law. We do not choose whether to be bound by our national regulations. We have some matter of choice in that we can choose which country to live in with certain very clear limitations, but we don't choose which laws govern us. You don't get to choose that, today I don't want to be governed by the tax law, for example. Some people try, but not good. Don't do it. So, consent. What does that mean? That means that the way that we talk about bindingness of international law is essentially, do they want to be bound at any given moment or not? But there are modifications. So the reason that we talk about international law, and the next question is, so is it then even law? Isn't it just, a continuous, diplomatic relation or negotiation? And many people argue that it isn't law, and it definitely isn't if you only define law as something that works in a similar way as to national law. But an argument for why it is law is that it is still, and this is where we're going to be also very debatory and comparative, it is more binding than if there wasn't a law. So what do I mean by this? Let's say two countries say, hey, let's make sure that companies in our countries can trade freely between each other. That would be cool. Okay, so both countries make a national law to say that there will be no tariffs on entry of goods. If there isn't a treaty, then there is literally nothing to stop a country from just abolishing that law the next day. If there is a treaty, then there is the other country at least has very, very clear proof that an agreement was violated. So think of it closer to contract law in a national setting. That is to say that if you and I agree that I'm going to sell you a bike, but we say, I might sell you a bike and I don't, then it's hard for you to argue that I violated an agreement. But if we say, I will sell you that bike, and I sign a piece of paper, then it is clear you can show everyone, hey, he violated the agreement. So this is the difference. If you sign something that is considered international law, that could be a treaty, that could be an entry into an agreement, it could be some of the laws that govern, international laws that govern members of the UN. All of these laws, if you have consented into them in the first place, then yes, at any point you can choose to exit, but it is clear for everyone that you have violated an agreement. So this is also the first tip in terms of debating international law, is analyze the incentives that lie around wanting to either uphold or not caring about violating an agreement. Some states require the legitimacy that comes from being known as a state that upholds agreements, and some states care less. Syria maybe cares not so much currently about the legitimacy of upholding international agreements, but perhaps countries like Denmark or Germany care more about it because they want to have many agreements with countries around the globe. Does that all make sense? Yes? Are there any questions or thoughts so far? Yes.
Could you extend some of the same ideas to stuff like international climate agreements, like the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement, etc.?
Yes, good question. So we can do a quick detour. What is international law? Public international law is any agreement that is made between countries. So the Kyoto Protocol is considered public international law. Where it gets a little bit iffy is, but fortunately that won't be relevant for debating, is that not all of these things are considered binding. Some are just declarations where it said like, I am going to do it. And some of them are actual agreements. We don't need to discuss that distinction. I'll just say now that that exists. So for the purpose of debating, typically it will be rather clear whether it's binding or not, because it's not supposed to be a debate exclusively for law students. Okay. Any more questions regarding bindingness? No? Good. Okay. So in essence, I mean, of course, there are infinite amounts, well, not infinite, but there's a lot of nuances to this concept and to this whole thing. But fortunately, it is in fact only this. It is just consent. Do they want to do it or don't they? And that relates again to the point that was made from the crowd before about lack of enforcement and whether it's binding. It depends on the size of the country. The United States can get away with more, but they still take costs. If they exit an agreement, they still take costs and hits to their legitimacy, to their reliability, and that kind of stuff. The United States were harder to make diplomatic agreements with and to have diplomacy with in general and make agreements with under Trump, who was just all willy-nilly exiting and entering agreements. Whereas that's internationally, people prefer presidents like Joe Biden that seem to be more reliable in that sense. So it does still matter, even if you're a big country. But yes, you can typically force the hand of others because it all depends on consent. All right. That was it for the theory of bindingness. Just to make sure that everyone is on board. So for everyone online, are there any questions from you? Something in the chat. If breach of law, then sanctions? Question mark. Yes, that is also true. And we'll actually get into this as we talk about sort of debate mechanisms as well, which is to say, what happens, sort of, why would we then, what can we say, what type of arguments can we make when it comes to international law? Let's say that we have a debate about the Paris Agreement and whether or not the US should have left. Really unbalanced motion. But let's say that we were debating whether the US should have left the Paris Agreement or not. What are some things, what are some arguments that we could make? And don't worry, I will get back to your sanctions. So first of all, overall, it is all about country incentives. Country incentives, good. And we're still on time, cool. So I'll take a few minutes to allow all of you to come up with your suggestions. What are some country incentives that might matter? So, I mean, we've talked about legitimacy already, so I won't let you take that. That's mine. Legitimacy. what other incentives might there be for a country in order for them not to violate or to care about international law? Yeah.
Economic incentives.
Economic incentives. Very good. Could you elaborate a little bit?
So that could either be that whatever is in the agreement is actually economically beneficial because it means it allows trade with other countries or makes something more easy, more cheap, whatever. But it could theoretically at least also be that if they violate the agreement, so indirectly, other states will, for example, say, oh, if you don't stick to that agreement, we will cut development aid, or I don't know, some other sort of repercussions, sanctions, if you will.
Very good. Yes. And there we got to them. So quickly recapping what was said, if it wasn't audible online, is that economic incentives, both in terms of direct trade, those could be in terms of trade agreements, and again, also connected to legitimacy. So countries might want more trade agreements in order to boost their trade, international trade, or they might just want that specific trade agreement and therefore want not to violate it. Additionally, then also sanctions. Yes, sometimes violating international agreements and international laws incurs sanctions, and they have economic costs. Even though it always feels like sanctions are underwhelming, don't underestimate the effect that they have. So, you know, it's not going to stop. Sanctions alone are not going to stop Russia from invading Ukraine, but don't underestimate their effect. It is still hurting the Russian economy. Cool. But I'm no economic student, so I'm not going to argue whether and how much. You had a point as well?
Well, generally just diplomatic considerations. It might, I mean, those can both have economic and sanction repercussions. But it can also just be like if you violate some sort of agreement you have with another country, you're gonna end up in some sort of war, especially if it's an Israel-Palestine motion.
Yeah.
If we start messing with the Oslo Accords, which they kind of recently have done, maybe a civil war is brewing.
All right. Yes. And again, just summarizing, what was said was diplomatic effects and how it might lead to conflicts and ultimately war. I'll say, of course, be careful with making war arguments. You know, they might often make you sound extreme and delusional. But I think that one way, I'll give one quick tip here. One way of making the war argument, especially when it comes to international law, is to say, listen, we're not going to stand here and argue that the most likely outcome of this motion is that there will be war between these two nations. But we do argue that it makes it more possible. And we think that even though it is unlikely that it happens, still is a significant impact that should be considered. Just a phrasing to keep in mind. Because if you're just arguing that war will happen, you sound delusional and not very persuasive. But generally, also talk about conflicts in less severe instances. Conflicts can arise in many, many different ways. Cool, very good. Let's see. Anything else clearly? Any other points? Yeah? Backlash? What? Very good.
And especially if it's a liberal democracy, then that argument is a bit harder to make, but that the population gets so dissatisfied, either because of the effect that the breach has in terms of economy, diplomacy, legitimacy, or just simply because they are like, well, we've elected a government that said they would keep the Paris Agreement, and now they're not, so we're demonstrating. And then it would be for their job.
Excellent. Especially in democracies. Very good. Yes. So what was said was national backlash, and essentially also, especially, of course, in Western liberal democracies. So this brings me on to, and I'll add one to this one, which is also just values. So one thing is, of course, definitely when someone pulls back on an agreement, that might have national backlash. A lot of Americans, probably not, didn't change a lot of minds, but at least, but a lot of Americans disagreed heavily with Trump's move to exit from the Paris Agreement. So that's one thing. National backlash might happen. Keep in mind then I think in order to make that argument, you generally want to have a decent understanding of the national political climate, because in a highly populist state, I think if you're looking at Viktor Orban's government or the Polish government, maybe that's not where that argument might have the most effect, because they have specifically rhetoric that is good at combating international legitimacy and maintaining national sovereignty and all that kind of good jazz. So do keep in mind that you should have a pretty good idea of the national political climate in order to make that argument. But in certain scenarios, that can be very, very effective. And so you can argue, I think the Danish government would be very wary of clearly violating international agreements, as that might, bears the risk. But it's still not, like, it's not what would trip the government. So you need to have a pretty good understanding of the national climate. You're smirking.
I'm mildly disagreeing because, for example, the Danish government has been in violation of the Schengen Agreement for 8 years.
Oh, yeah. No, but all countries are in violation of many things. There are some things that we might care about. Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. It always depends on everything. And if nothing else, then take this away. Anyone who studies law knows these two words better than anything else. It depends. Good. But I will say one other thing, values. Do also consider that certain regions, certain countries have made themselves poster people of certain values. And if they have so, they probably care about maintaining their position as poster people for those values. That could be the European Union and the values of democracy and freedom and all of that good jazz. We care about those things. And if violating an agreement is in violation of those values, that is also an incentive. Not because that they actually necessarily care more about the values than some economic benefits. But it's harder. It can be very, very hard to regain that image as the poster person for those values than perhaps just getting another trade deal at some other point. So do also consider those, but I will say the best mechanisms that you can make, the most effective mechanisms and impact you can make, is typically going to be on legitimacy, economic incentives, and diplomatic relations. So that's where it also ties very closely in with international relationships. Cool. Before I do the final installment, talking about some concepts that you think would be interesting to debate, and then we can discuss those a little bit, a few tips on sort of how to make arguments and how to talk about them. Analyze countries as very big people. What do I mean by that? Good question. So countries are run by people, and countries therefore have similar incentives and behavioral patterns as people. Differences are that they are run by many, many people. So maybe the type of erratic behavior will be different than the type of a person. Maybe it's not having a cigarette or buying chips, but but still, and erratic behavior comes to show in different kind of ways. But still, they are people. Analyze them as people. That is to say, countries want things and countries don't want things. So when you're talking about, economic incentives, then think of that person. Similar to when you're analyzing a politician, you're analyzing them in that context of being a politician. Okay, so they're a politician, they're probably thinking about the next election, so their perspectives are short-term. Okay, countries are the same. They're a democratic nation, so who is ruling it is probably thinking about the next election. They're a dictatorship. Okay, they're thinking about some other things. So think about them as people. All countries have a circumstance that makes them want some things and makes them not want other things. But be very, very clear about, in the beginning of every debate, two clear tips. I don't know how much any of you have talked about framing, but I'll just say, if you know framing, this should always be a part of your framing. If you don't know framing, just say it at the beginning of your speech. Set up what what do these two countries, these countries that we're talking about, care most about? And if we're talking about a lot of countries, then do an aggregate. What do these countries care most about? Give one or two metrics, because if you are forced to talk about everything that they might care about, because countries literally have to care about every single thing. So identify one or two metrics or one or two things that they will care most about in this debate. And be as specific as possible. Don't say they will care about money. Every country cares about money. Which money? Whose money do they care about? They care about having trade access to China. That's what this country cares about. Be specific, because that allows you to be more impactful in your arguments, because you can show that one thing you can't show, but typically in a debate, you can't win everything. So you're on Gov, you might get some money in one way, but opposition says that you lose money in another way. And that's probably true. Both things are probably true. So make sure you're specific. Specific in the beginning about what do these countries specifically want. And in trying to determine that, think about them as people. The final thing before I leave you, I guess I have 2 minutes left, if I'm not misunderstanding everything about the format today. Final thing is just, does anyone now have a concept in mind that they are, or something that they've learned today that they're keen on using in the next debate that they would like to share with the class?
I certainly need to pay attention to the being specific and trying to do it nearly once, because I often feel it's a bit risky, because if I lose that specific point, then I lost. Okay, okay.
Yeah, just trying to make it more audible.
I will try to be louder. So I was saying that I need to be reminded of being specific, because I feel quite often when I'm in prep, I feel that it feels risky to be very specific, because if I lose on that one thing that I spend a lot of time on, then not a lot will stand. Whereas if I'm being more broad, they care about money, there's like a broader chance that something will stick, but of course that something won't be as good.
Very, very good point. And I think that in general, that's something that I would always, that one of the tips that I think I give most frequently is to be more specific, but also to allow trade-offs. Like if the motion allows for you to win on all metrics, it's a bad motion, and it probably it shouldn't have ever been said. And probably the people who said it are smarter than that. So you're not supposed to win on everything. And yes, sometimes you'll choose wrong, but do always choose what you're going to be winning on and focus on those things. That applies especially to international law, and international relations motions in general, because there are so many metrics. But yes, I would say in any debate, choose on which metric you're going to win, and just fight on that, and give your opponent something. It's usually easier. You can try and mitigate it, say why it's less important. But yeah, I mean, of course they're going to do something that makes you also sound more reasonable, and people like reasonable people in general. Then that will conclude the online portion of our workshop. We are going to have a very enjoyable debate on our end. I hope that it was that you all online got something out of it. And if there are any questions on debating international law, feel free to just hit me up.